This is very exciting. For me personally, I've been wanting to talk to you for quite a while, but to get Ariel off my back as well. She's like, we need to get him here. We need to get him here. And so we got him here. So it's working. So thank you.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for the free kombucha. You guys told me that. I'd have been here yesterday.
You would have brought your friends. Now, for the next 25 minutes or so, I want to get to know you. Obviously, a lot of the people are fans. They know who you are with NPR, your podcast, the things you've done in the past as well. I want to work backwards, though, a little bit. I want to talk about what you're doing now and then what led you to this.
Yeah.
But before we get into that, in a sea full of outliers, in a festival full of people that are doing amazing things on their own, what makes you an outlier?
What makes me an outlier? I think for the most part, like, nothing about my background means that I should podcast. I didn't study journalism. I am not from like a coast. I'm from like South Texas. I grew up with a crazy speech impediment and like couldn't talk for many years. I am not an expert in anything, but
welcome. You're in the right place.
Yeah, but like it just kind of worked itself out, and I think the thing that I'm still trying to tell myself, and I think the thing that all podcasters need to realize is that there's no central casting for it, and if you want to do it, just do it. Like, just do it. So yeah, I think in many ways, my whole being is outlier-ish.
Yeah, you shouldn't be here, but yeah, here you are. And again, in a sea full of this lineup that we had has been amazing the last 2 days. I don't know, obviously you guys have been around for a little while. Great people. You stood out a little bit just because I like what you said, Texas. I mean, you've been all over the place. You studied music and science at school.
Yeah.
There's no reason why you should be doing what you're doing now.
Yeah.
For those few that don't know exactly who you are or what you're doing, let's talk about It's Been a Minute and what you're doing now.
Yeah, so It's Been a Minute is a twice-a-week podcast and a once-a-week radio show. And the goal for the show and our episodes on Tuesdays and Fridays is to have conversations that help our listeners make sense of the world right now. So the Friday shows are me in conversation with other journalists about the big headlines of the week, with some listener calls as well. And the Tuesdays are deep dive long form interviews with authors and artists and creators. We most recently this past Tuesday talked to Natasha Rothwell, who plays Kelly on Insecure from HBO. She was delightful. And so what we do with those 2 episodes every week is we pare those down to an hour of radio that then goes to over 220 public radio stations each weekend. And so the secret process for making this show is that this show and a few others were launched to help replace Car Talk. Car Talk, the public radio institution, was taken off the air finally last fall, and NPR was so worried about finding a way to replace it because it's been the biggest public radio show of all time. They launched several shows to replace it. So my show was one of those replacements.
And now, but this has been, what, a year and a half or so?
So we launched the podcast last June, and the radio version of the show started like the first week of October. So the radio version of our show turns 1 next week. Our goal was to be on 100 stations in our first year. Happy to say that we are on over 220 stations.
Congrats, big deal, for sure.
So that's good.
Yeah, so let's stick here in this time frame for a bit. You have the best job. Right?
Do I?
Do you?
I do.
In a room full of podcasters and podcast lovers, you get to talk to cool people. You get to kind of do what you want in a creative way. You have obviously a lot of say in the show and the things that you do. What are some of the things that aren't so fun behind the scenes, right? Of course, for entrepreneurs, for podcasters, we only see the good stuff, right? The stuff that we put out there on social media, on our shows. But there are things that aren't so glamorous and maybe a little bit hard. What are some of those things for you?
It's a slog. You know, we're making 2 podcast episodes every week and an hour of radio every week. I don't have a co-host, and we don't really do reruns. So every week, it's multiple feature interviews, prepping to lead a conversation about the news of the day. So for instance, on Monday, we're planning a big episode tied to Coming Out Day and the history of that day and how it's changed. So I'm talking to an LGBTQ theorist at 10 in the morning. Then I'm talking to a congressional candidate after that. Then I'm talking to Stacey Abrams, who's running for governor in Georgia after that. And then I have a donor event because NPR trots their hosts out there like show ponies to ask for money too. And like that's just an average Monday. And on top of that, come every Friday morning, I have to know enough about the week that was to lead a conversation about it. So I think the thing that surprised me the most with this show is that you're always kind of working and there's no real break, especially given the radio side of the show. Like we have to make an hour of radio every week. We just have to.
Is this something that you can keep going long term? I mean, you know, maybe the stress from my side, the stress of keeping on top of current affairs, you know, different topics, different people that you're going to bring on the show. I mean, that's like you're saying, never ending.
Yeah.
It's going to keep going. I mean, the show, like the way it is now, what's it going to look like in 3 years?
I think there are conversations. I think so. When we launched the show, it was two of us. It was myself and Brent Bachman, who is a producer that I've worked with now for many years. Brent Bachman helped launch the NPR Politics podcast, which I was one of the original co-hosts of. So I've been working with Brent for years. And basically, the show happened because I told my bosses, just so you know, when the campaign is over, I'm not covering politics anymore. You find a new place for me, wherever it is, but I'm not doing that. And that happened around the same time that NPR was trying to replace Car Talk. And Brent said, well, let's make a new show with you. And I was like, sure, whatever you want, fine. NPR let us sit in dark studios for 6 months to make this thing. But at launch, it was me and Brent. It was just the two of us. And there was no roadmap, there was no game plan. So we just said, let's make some shit. And then Brent has the stamina of like 3 workhorses. I'm a show pony and I'm lazy. So around 6 months in, I was like, Brent, we're doing 2 episodes every week. Are we ever gonna? Do we have a break? And so we're still having those conversations. And I think we're trying to move to a point where we're making shows that are evergreen, that we can rerun. We're trying to formalize some guest host or co-host options for the show, but
so it's ever changing.
It's ever changing. I mean, the format of the show now is different than it was a year ago, and what you hear a year from now will be different. I think the 2 constants are whoever's hosting it, me right now, like bringing a lot of me to the show. When people listen to the show, they know exactly who I am, what I'm into, what I like, what I don't like, and I just share a lot of personal things that other NPR hosts do not. I think the second thing is that the underlying emotion for the entire show all the time is optimism. We want to show people the world and the news of the world, but we want to remind people that regardless of the headlines and the news cycle, it's okay to be happy about shit, and it's okay to laugh at stuff. So we close all of our Friday episodes with a montage of listeners who have sent us voicemails describing the best parts of their week.
Fantastic, for sure.
And so on any given week, you're hearing strangers talk about a birth or a marriage or a graduation. We had one guy call in one week, and it makes me cry whenever I think about it. He was colorblind his whole life, and he had some corrective lenses or surgery to help him see color, but he didn't pop them in for the first time until he was at the Grand Canyon. So he calls us from the Grand Canyon and says, I am seeing color for the first time this week. And waterworks, right? Tears all around. And I think it's good to do that. One, because we don't experience news in a vacuum. We experience news in the same feeds and scrolls as personal life events of our friends. And 2, we should never forget, regardless of how shitty the news can be, that like life is still a life to be lived, and we're not meant to live a life without at least some small wins all the time, you know?
Now you're at NPR, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, great company,
Yeah.
great organization, right? It works okay. But you have the safety of NPR, but still, you need to do things on a regular basis to rise above the noise. What keeps you up at night? I mean, that would freak me out. And now, if I miss an episode or a week on my show, nobody's gonna die. I rarely get an email saying, "Where's your show for that week?" Right? But more pressure on this. When you're sitting down, when it's all quiet, what are you thinking about the show? I mean, what are some of the things that are keeping you up?
I'm the member of the team who's most obsessed with metrics.
Really?
I fret about it all the time. I always want to know, like, is the station count growing? Are the downloads growing? Are the users growing? I'm always thinking about cross-pollination, like how can I be in another space to plug the show? But I think the thing that keeps me up the most at night is like making sure that I'm emotionally prepared to deliver at tape time. I found that like half of the work of the show is emotional. I have to show up Friday morning for taping in a good mood. Sure. I have to be rested. I have to have had my run. I have to have had my coffee.
You have to be on, right?
I have to be
at
on.
All time, yeah.
And so I used to think that like the only work for the show was a prep for the interviews, but the labor is emotional labor, so I'm very intentional about like scheduling time for Sam to do Sam and have my space. Like usually every morning I need 3 hours of alone time before I see people, and I've carved that into my life, into my schedule, and I'm just like, it's known. Like if I don't have that, if I don't have time to meditate and do my thing and read up on the news, I'm not gonna sound good in studio. So being very intentional about, I don't know, it's so cliche, but being intentional about the self-care required to deliver what is a performance for your audience every week, that's been the biggest growth thing for me. So I am crazy obsessive with exercise and sleep. Like I have to make sure that I exercise every day. I have to make sure that I'm in bed by a certain time, and I have to like have a mental calculus every day that like makes sure that Sam is in bed on time. It's so weird, but
it's working for you, obviously.
Yeah.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
What I'm trying to figure out, right? Obviously, we've known the show. We're fans of the show. I'm trying to figure out the why, right? We kind of talked about it a little bit, but you're talented, you're young, you're hungry. You can be doing just about anything else. Why this? Why now?
Every week the job is different. Every week I talk to someone different. Just to give you kind of the range of the last few folks that I've had conversations with. We talked with Kelly from Insecure, but I also talked with an economics expert on the idea of universal basic income. And before that, I talked with a political scientist about how our politics is becoming very nationalized. We're doing a coming out day episode where we're hearing from listeners tell their coming out stories. And I'm talking with leading, LGBTQ theorists. I just had a conversation with Ike Barinholtz, one of my favorite actors, about his new movie. Like, we get to go all over the gamut. We had an episode a few weeks ago where I talked with 2 White House correspondents about what it means to cover the Trump White House right now. Like, we get to talk about everything except sports, because I suck at sports. That's like, there's no other job that I could have where I get to talk about everything, and most people just say yes, because it's NPR.
For sure.
Like, the only real challenge for us is people say yes too much to NPR, so they'll want an author or an actor on my show and some other NPR show, and then I get really territorial. But people say yes when we ask to talk to them, and that is, like, it's still remarkable to me, because who the hell am I, Yeah. But we have this name and this brand behind us that gives us incredible access, and in the same way, because our show is heard in podcast feeds and on the radio, our listenership runs the gamut. All ages, all political persuasions, all parts of the country and the world. We have a lot of podcast listeners in Australia, and our biggest radio audiences are in the South and the Midwest. Like, that I love that.
That's strange. I never would have thought about that.
Yeah, the South picked us up really quickly, and the Midwest took to us a lot. It's funny. The last strongholds, as far as radio cares, that we're really striving to get are the coast.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, with this, what you're doing now, and again, we're going to work backwards here in just a bit, but again, in a room full of podcasters, some of us have interview shows, conversation
I'm going to open
shows,
this kombucha and keep going.
Those type of things. Sometimes I'm not in the mood, right? I mean, you said the health and all that's the keeping the exercise and all those things. It's hard to fake it on a show when you're having somebody, when you're interviewing somebody, when you're talking to somebody. Other than maybe the exercise and the sleep that you just talked about, can we truly fake it? Can we fake it some weeks? Are you coasting some weeks? And if so, what are some hints for all of us?
Yeah, I'm going to tell you a secret that I learned, and as soon as I learned it, it changed everything. Don't talk to people that you are not personally interested in. Don't do it. It's never worth it. Without fail, my team brings me random musicians every week to do music interviews, and I'm like, if I don't like the music, we're not talking. Example, Yola Tango, classic band, been around forever, legends. My boss wanted me to talk to them. They had a new album coming out, and I was like, fine, whatever. I don't know who they are. I don't like their music. But I prepped for the interview and tried to get into it, wasn't into it. And they come in the booth, and they were just jackasses. And I didn't like them. They didn't like me.
You're being recorded, by the way. I'm just going to go all over.
Yola Tango, you're jackasses. And the interview was bad. And they did that thing where, like, I would ask them questions, and they'd be like, well, why are you asking that? And I'm like, I don't know. It's a fucking interview. But they sucked. And then we had to kill the interview. Like, we had to kill it. I prepped for it. We taped it. We mixed it. It was edited. And finally, someone was just like, this sounds like shit. And I said, yeah, it sounds like shit. and we killed it. And I realized in there, like, if I'm not into it, it's not worth having the conversation. And my job as a host is to be intentionally curious about a lot of different things. So I want to be someone who is curious about new stuff. But if it's just not jiving, then don't have the conversation. You cannot fake it, no matter how good you are.
I love that.
Yeah.
Right. And look, hopefully, we're in a position where we have control of our own shows.
Yeah.
We can do those things. So listen up. Now let's talk about this. Before you were doing this, you were in D.C. covering politics.
Yeah.
I mean, pretty self-explanatory, but I want to talk about the transition from politics to what you're doing now, and from D.C. to L.A. I mean, it must have been quite a change.
Yeah.
What was your mindset when you were like, oh, shoot, I might need to be in L.A.? What was that like?
So I started with NPR in 2009, and I first got sent to NPR West in Culver City in 2012. I was still producing, and my West Coast counterpart, she wanted to get back to the East Coast, so they just basically played switcheroo. Amy came back to D.C., I went to L.A. So I lived in L.A. almost 3 years before they called me back to D.C. to cover the campaign. When I came back, I said to myself, this will be a nice, like, thing to check off the box. I covered a campaign for NPR, a thing to do, good for the resume. We launched the NPR Politics podcast in the midst of the campaign, and it just took off. At our high points, we had 1 million unique listeners every week. I was one of the first co-hosts with Tamara Keith, who was the hardest working person in show business. But towards the end of the campaign cycle, they were like, all right, we made this thing that's really working and moving and grooving. You're doing this for the next X number of years. Nice. And I was like, I never told you that I was going to do that. I miss LA, and I want to cover different stuff. And so there was a long negotiation. And basically, it was me and management saying, I want to stay at NPR, but I got to do some new shit. And Brent, he was like, well, we got to make some new shows, replace Car Talk. How would you feel about? And I was like, sure, whatever. And so literally, when I left the politics team the day after the inauguration, and they said to Brent and I, have us a show in 6 months. And it was like, I can't explain to you how transformative those 6 months were, because for the first time in a year and a half, and for many years, I really had no deadlines. I didn't set an alarm clock for months. I took off all notifications from my phone. I just like totally detoxed. At that point, I lived 3 blocks from the office. I made it a point to go home and take a nap every day. I got to work when I felt like getting to work, and I was just like trying to put myself in the mind space and head space of like creativity. And I know it sounds so obnoxious just hearing myself say it, but like it worked, you know, like having those months of not just of like an election detox, but like reserving all of my energy and thought just for creativity. I think that's what helped make the show. Because what we did for months as we launched the show is every day, every week, we would just go in the booth and try shit, literally. We tried monologues for a while. We tried calling stuff for a while. We ran the gamut and tried a bunch of stuff. And the stuff that we liked as we tried it out, we would put it in NPR One. It's NPR's streaming service. So we would just throw betas and pilots out and see what clicked. And we got to do that literally for 6 months. And then once we felt good about the segments and the format, we were like, okay, here's our show. But we would not have had the show that we have now if we didn't just have that space for creativity. Well,
let's talk about creativity, right? Again, we have a bunch of podcasters trying to make it. Some of them successful, some of us still trying to make it, those type of things. If we don't have the 6 months to just focus on our show like this, some hacks, some things that we can focus on. What have you learned in the process that maybe can help some of us get to that level?
Everything you iterate, have someone hear it. I think there is a tendency with creatives to, in the first versions of what they make, to really hold it close to the chest.
It's their baby. It's our baby.
It's their baby. But you know what? Everyone wants to see a fucking baby. It's a baby. They're cute. Show it, right? I think what helped us and what worked for us the most is that everything we made, someone heard it. And it can't just be people that love you. Like, have someone listen to your early stuff. Have that person be someone who you don't actually like that much, who doesn't like you that much, because they'll give you the most honest feedback. I think for us, knowing that everything we made was going to have a set of ears on it that wasn't me and Brent, and that was someone who was going to be critical and harsh with it if they had to be, that was the best thing. Literally everything we made, someone listened to. And it was a motley crew. We intentionally sought out different folks to listen to different things. We wanted a litany of people with different ears on it. So my biggest advice is, as you iterate, get feedback. Fight the urge to just coddle your baby and not let anyone see it. Like, it's a baby. Show it off, you know?
I like that. I come from the entrepreneurial startup side.
Yeah.
And with our business ideas, we validate them.
Yeah.
Right? Is this going to work? Let's get it out to the people, a diverse group of people,
Yeah.
and see what we get back.
Yeah.
Same way with the show.
Exactly. And like,
And not to your mom, because she's going to say she loves it, no matter
exactly.
what.
She's gonna say she loves it. And like, what was good for us, besides having editors in the building listen to us as we iterated, when we would put our betas and our pilots into NPR One, listeners could write back too and give us feedback.
That's awesome.
So we had listeners saying, I think that segment was too long that day. This music was not good. That post should be different. Like, really, really detailed, critical feedback from our listeners too. So that's the biggest thing.
Yeah.
Don't hide your light under a bushel or whatever.
That's
the hell
great
they say.
advice, for sure.
Yeah.
We're getting the 5-minute mark or so, but we can go a little bit longer. It's my show, right? I can do whatever I want. And plus, it's lunch. Nobody needs lunch right now. I want to open up to the rest of you. Any questions? And we can go on for a little bit longer, for sure. You know what, Ariel, real quick, because I know you're a big fan, so
Okay.
let's do it. Can we get a mic in the audience too?
Sam, can you explain why your shoes are off?
It's become a good luck charm. When we started the NPR Politics podcast, when I was in the office, just always have my shoes off. And before I knew it, the first episodes that we had taped of the Politics podcast, I had just happened to always have my shoes off, and I internalized it very quickly as like a good luck charm that I have to do. So now whenever I'm speaking on a microphone, the shoes are off. Otherwise, I don't feel like it's a thing I have to do. It's a little bit OCD, but yeah, that's why. Also, just at work in general, I don't wear shoes at work in the office. I don't like to.
Question.
So, how do you differentiate between radio and a podcast in your production style and your approach?
Yeah. You can't. I mean, we can't, because we know that it's going to both audiences. There's a lot of stuff that we'll leave in the podcast that gets cut for the radio by virtue of us trimming. So usually the 45-minute long-form interviews that we publish on Tuesdays get cut down to 14 to 17 minutes to end up in the radio hour. So like, just the math of it is cutting, but also we have to make sure that all of our product is inherently accessible, because it's not just going to be our podcast listeners who are diehards and who like this and will be Googling as they listen. It's going to be on public radio stations in the Midwest on Saturday mornings with listeners that are weekend public radio listeners. So we have to intentionally be overly descriptive. We have to explain, and I think it makes a better show. It just makes it really accessible. So we can't overthink what's podcast and what's radio, because we don't have the time to slow down that much. To like, when we tape the Friday episode at 7:30 LA time. The radio hour, which includes that episode, is being heard on the first stations Friday night. So we just got to go. So for us, it's like, whatever I say, I want to be able to work on both.
Yes.
Thank you. My question for you is, how do you talk about politics every week on your podcast in a world where it feels like there's like so many like very clearly, I think there's people out very clearly bad people out there, and it seems like you could pretty easily like hammer the same points about like, yes, this cast of 20 people are awful and continually doing awful things in the same expected awful way. Like, how do you find nuance into talking about politics when it's become increasingly black and white with pretty increasingly clear bad guys and sort of issues to talk about? How do you do it every week?
I think
So 2 times a week.
Yeah, there are a few mandates that come with having an NPR show. We don't endorse candidates. We don't say vote for that one. We don't say that one's the worst. But what I can do is say that was a dumb move. And if it was a dumb move from a Democrat or Republican, I can say that, and I take the liberty to say that. I also think that there are certain truths that are not partisan. Like, it is totally fair to say that Donald Trump is a chaos president. He is chaotic. That is his style. People that like him for that. People that hate him for that. But like, that's a truth, right? So those things I can say. And I think that the problem with this administration is that there is this attempt from the White House to convince you that a thing that is said that doesn't make them look good is actually a lie. It's like, no. Truth's still the truth. And if the truth makes you look bad, it's because Donald Trump was doing some bad shit. So I've tried to hold on to this idea that like there are certain truths, and we should say that. I think the second thing is that every Friday, in the luxury we have of taping the wrap episodes on Fridays, is that we can look over the week of coverage of politics and say, what did folks miss? You know, what has not been talked about yet? What ideas haven't been talked about yet? And that for me is the fresh way to get to talk about politics. I hate shows where it's just a recap of all the stuff everyone else said. My goal for the Friday episodes is what questions can I ask about this week in politics that I haven't heard asked yet in this paper, on the radio, etc. I also think that what helps for us is that we never have a chat about politics that is just what happened. It's also how it felt. Like, how did a week of Kavanaugh hearings feel for me as a news consumer? You know, how did that testimony feel for me as a news consumer? And those conversations give a certain heart, I think, to politics that is smart and not just here's the facts. It is totally appropriate to have a talk about politics on our show as a host, as someone who is also just a confused news consumer. And I think that gives you a realness and an accessibility that makes it not just politics as usual. That's the goal, at least.
Very nice. One more question. We'll do two. Go ahead. Yes, in the back.
Oh, I just wanted to know, because you were talking about your self-care habits and routines and stuff. I'm just dying to know what your bedtime is.
It varies, but I have to be in a bed before 11, usually, hopefully by 10. I'm an early riser. Without fail, I'm up between 5:30 and 6:30 in the morning. I only need 6 hours to feel good, but I have to be in bed by 11, and I have to make sure, I have to physically separate myself from my phone. So my nightly routine is turning the phone off, setting 5 alarms, telling Alexa to have an alarm, and then I go and I have my powered off phone and I put it in the cabinet on top of the oven on the other side of the apartment, because I don't want to have the urge to, if I wake up randomly at 3 a.m. to look at the phone, because then I'm done, right? Yeah. I also carve out time every morning for coffee time, paper time, run time, and then I usually try to meditate for 10 minutes, and I don't see people before that's happened. I don't do that, and I'm lucky to have a job where it's kind of flexible, so I can do that. But yeah, that keeps me as a happy camper.
Last question.
Mike.
What are your top 5 favorite podcasts right now?
Great question.
In terms of thinking about voice and how to host and how to be involved as a host, I think the most charismatic podcast hosts in the history of podcasts are Crystal and Kid Fury. They host a show called The Read. Have you guys heard of it? It is a wonderful, lovely pop culture podcast from a black queer point of view. And they literally, these two friends who are usually kind of stoned, they get together and just talk shit about celebrities for an hour or 2 or 3, and they end the show answering listener letters. But they have a certain rapport and banter with each other where they actually create their own language at some points, and they are incredibly invested in being authentically themselves. So they, in so many ways, have been a guide star for me when I think about bringing voice to what I'm doing. So that show, it is incredibly long. They don't edit it. They just record. So some episodes are literally over 2 hours long, but it's delightful. If you want to start listening to that show, start with their episode where they recapped Beyonce's performance at Coachella. It's called the Baychella episode. It was just brilliant, just brilliant. What else do I love? I love Planet Money and their offshoot podcast, The Indicator. In terms of narrative podcasts, no other podcast has a better understanding of structure and flow. The narrative arc of every episode of Planet Money is emotionally and spiritually fulfilling. You end the episode and you're like, all right, I went on a journey and the journey is done. We made it. There's so many podcasts that are narrated where you finish the podcast and don't feel like it's finished. I never feel that with Planet Money and The Indicator. So that's 2. What else? I love Startup from Gimlet.
It's a great one.
It's brilliant. It's just brilliant. The episode arc they had about Deb Charney, former head of American Apparel. Is it American Apparel?
Yeah.
Yeah. It was great. They also had an episode arc about black woman, lesbian tech entrepreneur who wanted to break into Silicon Valley. And it was just amazing. All right, what is that, 3? Okay, 2 more. I love, and not just because he's a good friend of mine, but Vox's daily podcast, Today Explained, hosted by Sean Armstrong. He is such an incredibly empathetic and tuned-in voice, and he is the future of podcasting, and I can't brag enough about the great work they're doing on that show. Fifth podcast.
Too many to pick from.
What's that? Too many to pick from. Rough Translation from NPR. Gregory Warner, longtime foreign correspondent, now tells stories about different parts of the world. And their first episode, which I was kind of involved in, they talked about how race is viewed in America and in Brazil. And so they do this thing where they look at one issue from an American lens and a foreign lens and like compare and contrast. It's really great. So that.
Awesome. Ladies and gentlemen, Sam Sanders, let's give it up.
Thank you guys. This is really fun. Thank you, sir.